Well, we're up to 40 participants. I guess Michael, you can start us off whenever you like, and I'm sure people will join in as we get going.
Yeah, that sounds good, Lucia. Okay, I'll go ahead and kick the webinar off. So first off, let me say welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar that's highlighting some of the recent work that the Oregon Department of Transportation has been doing around transit housing study. We're joined by some members of our consulting team, members from agency staff to highlight this really important work, and I appreciate you being here. My name is Michael Rock. I manage ODOT's statewide transportation planning group. Part of that group manages the Transportation and Growth Management Program. So you may have noticed this webinar is actually being co-sponsored by TGM, what that program's titled. And if you're not familiar with TGM, it's a joint program between ODOT and the Department of Land Conservation and Development that's actually going on its 30th anniversary this year. So it's a big year for TGM. TGM is designed to help link transportation and land use planning across Oregon. We try to help promote transportation options in communities all across the state, all different sizes. And this topic is obviously important to all of our communities in Oregon. One element of TGM is to provide information and resources to communities to tackle, timely topics, emerging topics, and it really is hard not to hear about the Oregon housing situation and all the challenges that are around that. And there's really probably no more timely planning topic than that at the moment. It's also a key priority for Oregon's new governor who started recently, and a focus for many state agencies. So very timely topic, and I'm again glad you're able to join and listen about this work that we've recently wrapped up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our agency project manager, Lucia Ramirez, to introduce the panel and highlight what we have planned for today's webinar. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Lucia Ramirez. I am ODOT's one of the principal planners in ODOT Salem Statewide Planning Office. And I was the project manager, as Michael said, for this study that we completed in the fall. Regarding this webinar, we will be recording this webinar. Emma from DLCD is our Zoom host, and she'll be running things in the background for us. We've disabled chat so that we can focus on using the Q&A button for questions. So please use the Q&A button to submit your questions. I'll be tracking those, and we plan to leave some time at the end for discussion. HDR and Eco Northwest consultants conducted the study for us. And two of our principal planners, our principal authors of the study, are with us today. Brian Waterman from HDR in Tallahassee and Madeline Barron from Eco Northwest in Portland. Brian is a senior transportation transit planner in HDR's Tallahassee office with over 20 years of experience in conducting transportation studies, developing policy recommendations, analyzing transit systems, and helping agencies address deficiencies and identify areas to expand. His expertise is in transit network design, especially as it relates to operations, passenger flows, and system efficiency. He's led or made significant contributions to local and state transportation programs by conducting equity studies, assessing the impact of electric vehicles, preparing transit development plans, and developing funding strategies. Madeline specializes in affordable housing finance, research, and policy analysis. At Eco Northwest, she evaluates housing solutions across the entire spectrum of the market: development feasibility, housing needs analysis, housing underproduction, affordable housing policies, anti-displacement efforts, and strategies to alleviate homelessness. Her work encompasses statistical analysis, strategic planning, real estate development, finance and funding, and scenario planning. Now, those folks, Brian and Madeline, are going to take us through what they found throughout the study today. And I'm going to turn over to them.
Great. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, Michael. Happy to be here. So a quick overview. You guys got our nice bios from Lucia. My name is Madeline Barron. I've been at Eco Northwest about 5.5 years as a project manager, working on statewide issues relating to housing, affordable housing, production, supply, homelessness. And I also serve on the Metro TOD Steering Committee, helping the regional government identify opportunities for TOD investments. Brian?
Thank you. Again, I'm Brian Waterman, HCR in the Tallahassee office, been with HCR for 5 years now. And what else I'd like to add to the bio given is I'm also pursuing a PhD in network design, trying to help agencies take advantage of emerging technologies to extend their reach and their efficiency in their operation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Our webinar agenda aligns the study components. We're going to discuss in the primer on how housing markets function, give a literature review of transit supportive housing development, review Oregon policies influencing transit-supported housing, go over some case studies, both nationally and in Oregon, review the survey we conducted earlier last year on this topic, and kind of give our final recommendations and highlight the toolkit we created for this project. And it's important to note that this was conducted during COVID, so the data was influenced by COVID and may not reflect current transit realities on the ground today. Next slide, and turn back to you, Madeline.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so a quick overview. As Brian mentioned, our webinar will follow the study's components. We had about 9 different components of the study, various tasks. Most were independent white papers. The overarching goal was really to identify the tools and strategies that Oregon communities can use to increase transit supportive housing. And next slide. So the legislature directed ODOT to complete the study, recognizing the very big, huge importance of transit and housing, both at the household level as it relates to gas prices and the affordability crisis happening across the state, and at the state policy level as communities work together to plan for the long term for their housing and transportation and transit investments. Next slide. So a big reason why study transit supportive housing? Well, we all, I think many of the people in this room and virtual room will understand the severe housing challenges that are facing Oregonians across the state. This chart comes from the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Pilot Methodology Report that was produced in 2021 from OHCS and DLCD. It demonstrates the severe housing needs over a 20-year time period by region across the state, and it's broken down into 3 components. The first column represents the projected need for housing just to keep up with population growth and household formation. The middle column represents underproduction and the units that are needed to recoup the development that has not been keeping pace with current development. So what the units that are needed on the ground today. And then the third column represents housing units that are needed to house people experiencing homelessness that are not typically considered as part of the projected need overall. So many of you might be familiar with these findings, but the bottom line is that Oregon needs about 580,000 new units over a 20-year time period, both to keep up with population growth, household formation, and to dig out from the underproduction and lack of units for people experiencing homelessness that is on the ground, is the current reality today. And this is really relevant to the executive order and recent actions from new Governor Tina Kotek. On one of her first days in office, she issued an executive order that directed state agencies and communities to work together to try to produce 36,000 new units per year for a 10-year, for the next 10 years. That number comes from 10 years of the projected need in that first column and trying to recoup all of the underproduction and the units needed for people experiencing homelessness over a 10-year time period. And it's important to stress that producing 36,000 units per year is a huge increase over what we've been producing statewide, about 20,000 units in the past several years. So this has major implications for housing affordability, for households, for community planning, for transit and transportation investments, and importantly for the workforce, since we're going to need to recruit workers into the construction sector and the planning sector. So this is one of the biggest reasons why I think the legislature pushed for this study. And if we go to the next slide. We'll also see, as many of you I'm sure are aware, there's very important relationships between transit supportive housing, access to opportunity, access to transit. So research has demonstrated the numerous economic, physical, and health outcomes that come from living in areas with great amenities, good schools, good jobs, healthy environment. And researchers have also identified that the opposite, that housing underproduction or housing scarcity, is connected to homelessness, greenhouse gases, and vehicle miles traveled, when people have to live on the edges of metro areas to find affordable housing and then commute to job centers. Homeownership disparities by race or ethnicity, and also economic and racial segregation, are also related to underproduction, housing scarcity, and just not having enough housing choices for different households to meet their needs. Next slide. So what is transit supportive housing? I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. It's generally the co-location of housing and transit services. There's many goals about increasing ridership, increasing access, being efficient with land use, meeting climate change goals, reducing costs. At its best, transit supportive housing is self-reinforcing in that investments in transit support development, and then that development supports increased transit. And that has important implications, positive feedback loop to increase affordability, increase access, increase public health, and meet our climate change goals for the state. Next slide. Transit supportive housing has a lot of integration with different land use planning goals across the state. We particularly identified land use goal 9, which is about economic development, 10, which is about housing, 12, which is about transportation, and 14, which is about urbanization. Economic development ensures that local governments must plan for employment growth and have a sufficient land supply for employment needs over a 20-year time period. The housing goal is the same for planning for long-term housing needs, including how much housing is needed, what affordability levels, what housing types, and where. Goal 12, transportation, requires considering all modes of travel, planning to support future transit in different land uses, considering equity when making transit investments, and providing transportation options in multimodal systems. And then urbanization, as many of you know, requires jurisdictions to jointly establish and maintain urban growth boundaries, which helps set the understanding of what land uses are allowed and where, and how the various goals need to work together. So many of these can be in a little bit of conflict in terms of, if you have transit, do you put housing there? Do you put jobs there? Do you put both? How do jurisdictions align their needs and meet all the goal requirements? Next slide. There are many important players when it comes to providing transit and housing. DLCD manages the statewide land use goals. ODOT manages the transportation system and networks. Oregon Housing and Community Services is important as it aligns the funding for affordable housing. There are other state agencies that come into play, like the Building Codes Division. Of course, local governments have an important role to play when it comes to zoning and other land use controls. Tribal communities have an important role to play, as well as transit agencies in delivering the transit service. And then, of course, when it comes to building housing, developers and nonprofit organizations, along with service providers, have a role to play. So there's a lot of people involved in the provision of transit supportive housing. Next slide. It's also important to note that this work connects to a lot of recent state and federal legislation and recent government action. As the housing underproduction and affordability crisis has moved from bigger cities into all parts of the state in recent years, and as the climate crisis continues to grow, it's no surprise that we're seeing more legislation on these topics. I don't need to run through everything on the screen, but some housing bills that you'll recognize, some of the most impactful ones in the past couple of years. The Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Executive Order has a really big impact on the provision of housing and transit, and particularly the co-location of those services in what will be designated climate friendly and equitable communities around jurisdictions. The recent executive orders that I mentioned, and then importantly, highway and transit funding bills, and particularly the federal investments that are going to be coming down to jurisdictions through competitive grants. There's also a lot of draft legislation hitting the ground right now. The Oregon Housing Needs Analysis that I've mentioned before about the pilot results, lots of other housing bills as it relates to co-ops, equity co-ops, and numerous other parking reforms. There's transit and tolling land use bills. If anyone is interested, we can provide more information on these specific bill and House bill numbers. Next slide. So that's an overview of the what we did and the why we did it. And now I'll step through one of our first white papers, which was the Housing Market Primer. And this early paper served as a really great backdrop for the study, demonstrating how housing markets function and how they fail, which communities are likely to be most hurt when housing markets fail, and what those consequences are, along with what interventions from government and other players might be necessary when trying to right or account for market failures. It's actually a paper that Echo Northwest draws on really heavily and really regularly, since it very succinctly describes housing market development feasibility and the specific challenges facing affordable housing development. So I'll go over some basics beginning on the next slide. Housing markets are subject to the laws of supply and demand, although they're very heavily influenced by government regulation. In a recent book, Brookings scholar Jenny Schutz made a really great comparison between housing markets and other types of commodities, like, for example, the new car industry or car production industry. Car producers do not need to ask the government when they want to increase supply. They of course have to adhere to other types of regulations and laws, but unlike many other commodities, home builders do need to ask permission. They must ask their local government to allow them to build a house, and so they're heavily regulated. Although supply and demand do play a role in housing markets and pricing, government policies play a really outsized role in this market compared to others. And because governments can't really do a lot to affect demand, most governments would want to increase demand. Hardly any local governments would want to do something that decreases demand and pushes people away from their community. Governments can really only affect supply, and the ways that they can do that are pretty complex. So the dynamics of the housing market are really complex and fluid. Many factors are out of policymakers' control. Changes in demand and supply, movements in materials and labor markets, they all interact with one another, and with development costs and changing in household preferences, changes in demand. All of this comes together to affect the quantity, nature, and location of housing units that are both demanded and supplied across a region. Next slide. So how is housing built? It's a really long process that has uncertain outcomes and requires a lot of players being willing to work together and, importantly, to take on risk when it doesn't have a certain outcome. So public policies, this is a diagram that Echo Northwest uses a lot that demonstrates that there's a lot of overlap between these four basic components, but it takes all four components to come together for development to really occur. Housing development, any type of development really. Public policies like land use restrictions or zoning will dictate what types of development can occur and where, and changing these policies is a really complex process that impacts a lot of people in a lot of sectors. On any given parcel of land, the landowner and the developer will evaluate the site for its best use, and that must be allowed by zoning. This could be office, residential, commercial, housing, or leave it vacant. It will depend on the parcel's unique characteristics and the location and the overall market supply and demand for different development types. Market feasibility is a really complex process that compares the expected revenues and development costs, such as labor and materials, for a given project. For any project to be feasible, the value must exceed the costs. And when this doesn't happen, the project will require subsidies, land write-downs, value engineering, or other interventions to get to feasibility, to get to the project to pencil. And lastly, because nearly all housing development is funded by debt, capital is necessary to pay for the cost of development. The lending terms and expected return will influence the market feasibility. And when real estate development doesn't meet those investment returns that are required to take on the risk of the project, Capital is mobile. It'll flow to different sectors that might be offering higher returns, such as stocks and bonds. So development, and particularly housing development, is absolutely not a given. There's a lot that needs to come together for that to happen. Next slide. And if it's important to call out that affordable housing, regulated for certain incomes or certain rent levels, is even more complex. Shown here is a sample capital stack, which is used in the market feasibility analysis that developers and landowners will use like I mentioned on the prior slide. And so this shows the sources of funding in blue compared to the costs of development in green. And the cost of development will include your basic hard costs, your soft costs, and that investment return requirement that is needed to offset the risk of development. Because affordable housing has lower rents or purchase prices that are intended and designed to be affordable to lower income households, it starts out with a funding gap that must be overcome. This will be filled by a variety of sources: land write-downs, property tax abatements, or other philanthropic mission-oriented funding, free or low-cost dollars that could be provided by philanthropy, federal or state. And this really takes a lot of time and effort on behalf of the development. So it can slow down development and increase costs. And then, of course, affordable housing often faces opposition from neighbors or community members, slowing down the process and increasing the costs even greater. Next slide. So that was a really quick overview of our housing market primer, but I encourage you to visit the project website and download that report and pass it on to your next NIMBY that you meet on the street. This section steps through our policy review and literature review tasks. Next slide. The goals of these tasks, just like the rest of the study, was to review the literature and see what was working to incent and encourage transit supportive housing across the nation, and then to bring it home and evaluate the statewide policies that are affecting housing, transit, and transportation investments. As most of us know, the state does not have a lot of control compared to local jurisdictions. So there weren't heaps of policy documents that we could review. But the state, importantly, does control a lot of the funding for investments in housing, transit, and transportation. So that was a big area of focus on this task. Next slide. Quick takeaways from the literature review. These aren't going to be too terribly surprising for most people on this call. The general understanding is that land near transit can be more expensive, making development and particularly affordable housing development harder. However, that housing can reduce household transportation costs by offering access to transit and transportation. So that can be offset. We did see a study evaluating various components of transit ridership, and that study found that the quality of the service, including the pedestrian orientation and the headways, was often more important to transit ridership than the particular network or route or the area that it served. It's important when designing new routes and changing routes to think about the communities that are going to be impacted the greatest, and to, importantly, to talk to those communities about what they want and what they need. It's also important to note that policies that disincentivize personal automobiles should have a corresponding improvement in transit service and the availability of other transportation options. And this is so you can avoid just an overall increase in transportation costs for low-income households. So policies like gas taxes or parking costs or higher fees on cars. And then it is also important to note that transit investments must be balanced and carefully planned out with communities to avoid gentrification and displacement. So cooperation and coordination and outreach to communities is really vital. In addition, first mile, last mile connections in the urban form really, really matter about increasing ridership. Next slide. So on the statewide policy goal task, we evaluated the 13 different policies that you see on the screen here, the land use goals that we mentioned before. some land use and housing policies and recent legislation, both from OHCS and DLCD and ODOT, as well as specific ODOT policies listed on the right-hand side. The majority of these policies are held either by ODOT or a DLCD, despite the fact that DLCD is not necessarily a housing agency. Housing is just one component of its mission. And that calls into question and calls into stark reality the fact that Oregon does not have a comprehensive housing state agency. Although DLCD manages land use and OHCS manages affordable regulated housing, there's no other state agency that has a comprehensive view of the entire housing market and housing market production. However, in yesterday's Governor Kotek budget that was released, she calls for the creation of a housing production and accountability office that would sit within the Land Conservation and Development Department and provide technical assistance to local governments and developers who are working so that they can work to reduce barriers to production and also hold jurisdictions accountable to housing and land use laws that can help increase production. So this white paper steps through each of these 13 policies and describes how those policies can be supportive to transit supportive housing, might be a barrier, where there's gaps in policy, and where there's opportunities to improve the policy or improve coordination. Next slide. I have 3 examples, and like I said, we did this for all 13 of those policies. So if you're interested in looking at the statewide policy landscape, I would suggest you go look at this report. You know, here's an example. Goal 10 on housing is, of course, supportive of transit supportive housing. It encourages zoning and infill. It encourages affordable housing and compact mixed use areas. However, it lacks clear rules around how you use the trade-offs between commercial areas near transit or housing near transit. And also housing needs can be met by on the edges of urbanized areas that are harder to serve with transit. The gap, there's no specific requirement in Goal 10 that jurisdictions plan for TSH or TOD and actually co-locating housing near transit. And then there's some opportunities we highlighted given the recent legislation and the increase in production that some communities might see due to House Bill 2001 or House Bill 2003. And the opportunity is really if some communities that have been low density are going to be increasing their production, how does transit access and transit service align with those goals? How do they ensure that we're not putting housing where there's, especially low-income housing, where there is not enough or insufficient or low kind of service transit? So this was an example of kind of the SWOT analysis we did on Goal 10. I'll go to the next slide. We did the same thing for ODOT's transportation system plan guidelines and found, ways that it supports. Generally, just TSP documents must be consistent with other plans and other guidelines. However, the system plan guidelines typically offer solutions that revolve around capacity constraints, and those are typically auto-oriented solutions, so less about transit and housing and the co-location or getting people, getting developers to build housing and transit together. So we identified those gaps and identified some opportunities about how these policies, particularly the guidelines for local communities, could be improved. Next slide. And one more example, as I mentioned, because the state doesn't have as many direct policies in land use and housing and transportation, but the state does manage a lot of the funding. We identified the OHCS qualified allocation plan as a policy to evaluate. This plan is what oversees and directs the low-income housing tax credits for affordable housing development, and those tax credit programs are the largest source of funding, so it's important. As it might not surprise most people on this call, there was a lot of alignment and support in the scoring criteria for LIHTC projects to be near transit and have amenities and access in the location efficiency of where those projects are sited. Developers face, but one of the barriers is that developers may face trade-offs between the location efficiency scoring and other scoring criteria that particularly requires cost efficiencies because the land near transit can be so expensive. So we identify some gaps and some opportunities. Next slide. So, general overview of the findings from this is that transit supportive housing is not well defined, nor is it really a focus area in many of the state policies. A lot of the guidance will be updated to reflect new laws and new rules. So that is a hindrance of our webinar today, in that there's so much legislation happening, and this project was produced and finished, particularly this earlier task was produced nearly a year ago now. So there's a lot happening that will most likely improve the ability for jurisdictions to plan for transportation supportive housing. Coordination is really key, and Oregon state agencies are still pretty siloed. So departments can do a lot better in coordinating and working towards those same goals. And again, we identified the fact that there's a lot of opportunity to leverage the recent and the current draft legislation. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, Brian, or did you want to step in?
No, go ahead. You're good.
Okay, yeah. Next section is a set of white papers that we evaluated 9 case studies outside of Oregon and 8 case studies across Oregon that demonstrate the tools, opportunities, barriers, and best practices that communities have had in developing TSH. Are the locations, you can go to the next slide. The locations were chosen to achieve a wide geographic spread and to profile different examples of successes. And then they were eventually narrowed down based on data availability. Generally, we tried to rely on published research and literature, but in Oregon particularly, we had to rely on interviews, news articles, and other sources of information. And Brian, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. And to kind of build upon this, the case studies get a chance to really see some of the literature review ideas in work. So I'm going to focus on the outside Oregon case studies, and Mal's going to bring on the Oregon case studies. The outside Oregon case studies cover a wide variety of things, starting with Tallahassee and West Palm Beach, and the impact of system redesigns on travel choice and behavior. Minneapolis and Montgomery counties illustrate how collaboration and public engagement can help guide the process and encourage involvement and lead to better outcomes. Seattle and Dallas highlight some financial possibilities that can be used to fund affordable housing. And the remaining ones, Valdosta, Traverse City, Toronto, and Tribal, show that affordable housing and transit connections is not just a big city or even medium-sized city things. The rural and small urban areas, there are strategies that can be employed by them to further this connection. I'm going to focus on 3 of these to kind of go more in detail. All, again, as indicated earlier, all case studies are highlighted in the case study tech memo. Next slide, please. So this one hits near and dear to me on the idea of network redesigns. This is something I do a lot for trans agencies. Even then, the Tallahassee one is the one I actually did when I was working for Star Metro 10 years ago. The important concept here is when we look at a network redesign, it's a chance, an opportunity to look at the needs of the community and identify coverage gaps and missed opportunities. And what you'll see is this paradigm, and thanks to Jarrett Walker kind of illustrating this, of the ridership-based system versus the coverage-based system, where ridership focuses your service along key corridors to have a more efficient direct routing and encourage ridership, whereas coverage sees transit as a public service and trying to get the equal access across the entire thing. And this is a very interesting paradigm. So this case study kind of shows the 2 diametrically opposed approaches to some extent. So Tallahassee, again, near and dear to me, I did this. We focused largely on the ridership side of things and tried to focus on providing direct cross-town routes to connect suburban areas to job centers. But while it looked good on paper and it was successful in many aspects to it, we missed the connection to people's lives. We missed that there's more to the journey than just the journey to work, the trip and the journey to work trip. And as a result, we actually adversely impacted people's behavior, made it hard to get the key services. And so if part of the transit affordable housing connection is to make transit or transportation costs less expensive through better access and better improvement, the Tallahassee redesign did not really do that. again, it succeeded with the work connection, but the connection to the other services did not, and therefore some post-analysis done by many entities found that there was a lack of accessibility and possibly made some travel costs more expensive. On the other side of the coin was the West Palm Beach approach, is they try to strive for more of a balance between ridership versus coverage. And when you look at their analysis of the system, they found that through providing these connections, or feeding people into the route network, they're able to increase access to low-income people and provide better access to key services and really help promote a better environment. And shows that, again, when you change the transit network, when you change a route, a line, what have you, you are impacting travel behavior, and those impacts to travel behavior do have a corresponding impact to affordability and affordable housing. Next slide, please. Again, another Minneapolis and Prince George's County is a little bit, kind of brings in the idea of collaboration, stakeholder engagement, and like. And to me, successful transit or transportation projects are those that really give voice and power to those who do not have it during the transportation planning process. It means going beyond the traditional and public stakeholder engagement. We have these standardized plans that says we're going to do, reach out to these people through surveys, through public meetings, and so like. But there are voices and groups who may not have access to those public meetings, who may not be willing to participate in those public meetings and the like, that need additional attention and focus to make sure that their voices are heard through stakeholder engagement. And then you want to give those affordable housing advocates, community leaders, a seat at the table. So we look at the Minneapolis project, that was the Central Corridor light rail, or also known as the Green Line. The alignment, when the stations were announced in 2006, however, when they proposed the alignment, they left out a key station area that was in a low-income neighborhood. Therefore, this coalition formed the idea to wait a second here, you're asking us to walk up to a mile to get these other stations. Why can't you put a station here in our community, and what this does for us? And so through collaboration, through working, through making their voices heard, they've got that new station created. And that station has led to a much better outcome for them. And then Prince George County kind of shows that you need to rely on these community groups to kind of get a better feel for what's going on in the area. The the Purple Line Coalition gathered data, gathered the analysis to show the planners and decision makers that this is what's going on here. Here's where the needs are, and let's work together to create those beneficial solutions to promote affordable development around the station proposed to the service. I think the quote at the bottom really shows the impact public engagement has on transit project and how that leads to positive outcomes in the housing space. The community can pull together, gain some power, influence the outcome of a major infrastructure project. It demonstrates how important coalition building is. Now, again, the right people in the room, you're never going to have enough power to win. We learn never to give up something as possible to win. Next slide, please. And then I have to go to where transportation is really going in the future, and what is available for small to medium-sized cities or small rural areas. Innovation exists. It is possible in these communities. We're seeing this now with more and more rural and small clients looking at mobility on demand. Is you can for a much more cost-effective way do customized same-day service in these areas and provide a cost-effective way to provide transit. And when you provide that transit to these communities, you're lessening the need for the extra car, or you're lessening the need for the extra trip by automobile, saving them money to go forth with that. Valdosta, Georgia recently kicked this off back in 2021. They never had public transportation before. They did system-wide mobility on demand and saw a resounding success with that. Another good example is Wilson, North Carolina. They had a fixed route system, took it away, replaced with mobility on demand, and seeing much more benefits and provided greater access to low-income individuals to key jobs and services. And Traverse City shows the value of collaborations and partnerships. Is that you want to work directly with the developer. Where transit is available, even limited, work with the developer to find out where you can place housing or place resources prior to construction. And then working with other municipalities to help lower infrastructure costs, make it easier for the developer to build. And then having larger regional partnerships to help get much needed federal funds to make these projects happen. Next slide, please. Back to you, Madeline.
Yeah, thanks. So you saw the full list of 8 or 9 case studies we analyzed in Oregon. I'm going to highlight just a few here. The first is the Eugene River Road Santa Clara neighborhood. This project this case study evaluated 2 sites within this neighborhood one that was developed for affordable housing and one that was pending development on some surplus land from the Santa Clara Transit Station. The city had been working on this neighborhood plan with the community, with organizations, with residents, and the county and consultants since about 2017. So a lot of legwork went into building this, this plan and making this corridor successful. So there was a parallel effort by the transit agency to develop a plan for the corridor, identify improvements, and identify funding. So Iris Place is a 53-unit affordable housing development that was built by the nonprofit St. Vincent de Paul of Lane County. And one of the most important takeaways from this case study is that that took a lot of effort and a lot of funding and incentives to get it to work. I mean, not every city can offer free land, system development charges, property tax exemptions. Not every project receives 9% tax credits, which are more lucrative and more useful than the 9% program. It also received an allocation of CDBG and home funds. That's like 6 different financial incentives, in addition to close coordination with the community, close coordination with the developer, and willing participants, probably also just luck of timing. The site 2, the Santa Clara Station, Lane Transit District had to acquire a larger site than they needed for the station facilities during construction. And then the balance of that site has been under discussion as an opportunity site for affordable housing or other community priorities, but has yet to actually make progress, at least as of June 2022, when this case study report was finished. So some of the findings here were just that the discretionary review process can be a challenge. It takes a lot of community engagement and particularly proactive community engagement, and that coordination, of course, is really key here. So transportation planning can set the stage for affordable housing development opportunities, even if it takes time. So this the station area is a really hopeful opportunity for future development, but has yet to take shape. Next slide. The second case study I want to highlight is this Bend UGB expansion pilot program. So in 2016, there was legislation that offered a pilot program to cities that wanted to expedite UGB expansions if the land was restricted for affordable housing. DLCD manages it, and the legislation was passed in 2016, but had to be revised in 2019 because initially the requirements were a little bit too strict. The city of Bend was one of the first cities to pursue the pilot, and it was selected back in 2018, but as of the middle of last year, no development had begun. This project actually highlights the challenges of siting affordable housing on the edges of the UGB, where there's little access to transit, amenities, or services. It's not for lack of effort. There was a lot of city initiative and city support in terms of SDC waivers, gap financing, a density bonus, the expedited permitting, and they were willing to revisit the timing of their capital improvement and infrastructure funding and plans. But ultimately, this project had a number of challenges, and particularly during the pandemic, funding and the partnership, I think, went through some changes. So nothing has been developed as of yet. Next slide. The third one I wanted to highlight is an affordable housing development down in Roseburg. This was developed in an urban renewal area, and the city benefited from the fact that a housing needs analysis clearly demonstrated the dire need for low-income housing. In addition, there was a lot of cooperation, and the developer that we interviewed said that this project moved with incredible speed. ODOT ODOT was very cooperative on Highway 20, where the site was located, by performing a corridor study and agreeing to some improvements for the pedestrian orientation. The developer was willing and able in the financing to build a bus stop, and then the transit provider was willing and able to extend service to that bus stop. This is an urban renewal area that's on the edges of the community, but is planned for a bunch more development. It's across the street from a big park with, I think, a bunch of big baseball fields, and in an urban renewal area, it's slated for a bunch of future development. Again, cooperation, the city was an active participant and a project champion, and offered some different financing tools to get this going. Next slide. Lastly, Lincoln City workforce housing. So this is kind of a contrast to the Roseburg example in that this project has struggled for a number of years to get going, and I believe is still in pre-development or seeking funding to close some funding gaps. This project had pandemic-related delays, some site challenges, cost overruns. They didn't initially get the 90% LIHTC that they were seeking. And then due to those funding gaps and cost escalation from the pandemic-related supply disruptions, they're having, last we talked with them, they were having to value engineer the project. The developer made a really interesting point in saying that on the coast, undeveloped land is undeveloped for a reason, in that the remaining sites are very challenging to build on. And that was the case on this site. It was at the corner of Highway 101 and I believe like Northeast 25th. And it faces a really steep slope that requires retaining walls and pretty severe water runoff mitigation. ODOT was willing to allow a right-of-way from the site onto Highway 101 because the side street was too sloped. So that was great cooperation. But one of the major challenges with the site is that there's no crosswalk to the west side of Highway 101 and the rest of the city. And there aren't great sidewalks for the bus stop that's just a little ways away. So although many communities across the coast are in dire need of workforce housing, the challenges are just really immense. And the connection to transit service is also important and challenging here because the service is quite limited. There's only one bus that is operating on a loop, one bus route, I should say, with long headways that end at about 7 p.m. or so. So that's not very conducive to workforce. There's a casino and a grocery store and a hospital relatively close to this site, but shift work doesn't end at 7 p.m. along with the transit. So the project is a challenging one, although it's desperately needed. Next slide.
So the full case studies are again on Layville line, and there are some key findings we want to highlight on the transit side. Kind of again, looking beyond the fixed route means about being flexible and looking at how you can customize service to meet the needs of the community and the surrounding area. Collaboration is key. You want those key stakeholders on your committees when you do route changes, do premium transit projects and the like, make sure they have the voice. Transit is not just the transit line. It's the connections to the facility. It's the sidewalks. It's the amenities. It's the bike paths. And the better you're able to connect your transit service to the affordable housing project or the neighborhoods, the more easier it is for them to access it. And again, which in terms to them using the service and saving on transportation costs. Opportunities exist in the transit side to support those who are building affordable housing through creative financing districts, through including those creative financing strategies in your proposals. And as always with transit and in transportation planning in general, it does not end once public engagement does not end when the project ends. You have to continually reach out and find out what's going on. Where's the service not performing correctly and what changes can be made to get going? So you always got to keep engaging with them consistently to make sure that your voices are being heard. Next slide.
And some overview of the housing findings. So generally just affordable housing and housing development takes a lot of financial investment and a lot of sweat equity from the development team and the public partners. Eugene and Roseburg were examples of success. Lincoln City had quite a lot more challenges. So a realistic understanding of housing needs, particularly through an HNA, will help eliminate misconceptions and also direct efforts towards development. It sort of holds a jurisdiction's feet to the fire and the community when it's demonstrated that there's a need for this housing, and then maybe the discretionary review throws up additional barriers. So you're going to hear us say this a lot. Coordination is huge. There's a really big role for long-term land use planning and transit planning, and that can be really successful. That can be the key to a successful development and particularly transit route with good ridership. It's also really important to understand market forces. and master planning processes, and how markets change and master planning efforts need to be flexible enough to adapt to market conditions. Next slide.
I'm gonna spend some time here talking about the survey real quick. I'm not gonna go through all the results. There is a full survey tech memo on the website. So we did conduct next slide, please. We did, as part of the study, we did conduct, next slide, a study of the survey of agencies, entities, nonprofits, and like in Oregon to get understanding of the challenges, opportunities, and tools dealing with this topic. An idea here of who we receive respondents from. Again, a lot of them were in the Oregon area, had working for state or local government, or were a transit provider. Next slide, please. Trying to again, there is an evidence that there was collaboration, not as much as we would like though. And however, when it comes to collaboration, it really involves at the planning level or development review level. From there, when it comes to the siting and zoning decisions, collaboration with stakeholders kind of dropped off in our responses. Yeah, next slide. In terms of barriers to transit support housing, land availability top, and then accessibility is follow that. And then in urban areas. In rural areas, it's the distance to transit stops. Again, you're dealing with very, very low density, and you have very, very long routes or infrequent services that make it challenging to serve those ideas. That's where you need the partnerships and collaborations to make it work out there. And in both situations, funding is always a concern. Transit is a challenging thing to fund at times, and dealing with staffing and other issues. And sometimes when there's not the staffing or the funding, service gets cut. Next slide. So when it comes to solutions to transit supported housing in the areas, certainly we want to improve the accessibility, provide those other modes in urban areas, promote transit-oriented development. A lot of people also said parking minimums or reduced restrictions is the way to go. So if you can decouple parking from housing, it makes it easier to do TODs because you don't need to have the extra space set aside for that infrastructure. In the rural areas, the same thing on accessibility. However, now we're getting into the idea though that transit service may not exist, therefore making it challenging, or where you can, there's limited opportunities to do higher density transit-oriented development. There might have the infrastructure in there to support it. So again, when you try to do transit support housing in rural areas, the idea is to really try to concentrate that in key areas along the existing transit routes. Next slide. Again, kind of the key takeaways and stuff, again, is from the survey, full report is online, is that transit needs to be expanded. It's still not covering everywhere. And if we're going to try to improve the connection between these two areas, we need to have better transit service, expand premium transit opportunities, and have the high frequency response. Coordination needs to exist as well between the housing, the developer, between all parties involved. As Madeline indicated, that Venn chart is that you need to work together to address all those various issues, provide the land to do that. And then as we see with emerging technology, that first mile, last mile connection, that makes transit more effective and increases the reach. If you're able to provide the access to other means to bus stops, you can possibly extend the reach of transit and grab housing units that are a little further than the traditional quarter-mile walking distance. Next slide, please. So lastly, solutions and recommendations. We combined all this information into an interactive toolkit that's also online, and we're going to kind of highlight some of the key tools that we identified. Next slide, please. So the toolkit that's online is intended to provide ancient readers with an overview of different tools that could be employed by those involved in this process. Most municipalities, tribal areas, transit providers, developers, and the like to encourage housing and development, including is affordable housing as well as connected transit service. It presents the summary of all the lessons learned, and it is an interactive PDF. So the first area of tools we identified deal with the transit system and service. These range from coordinating and better planning to expanding the housing, the transit footprint, and using available land, extra land to promote housing developments. I think I'll just kind of keep going here. Next slide. I think this is
yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, this slide is a little bit back towards the survey, and we thought, just reiterating, not many of the survey respondents indicating that they were using many of the tools that are available to them. So we wanted to highlight that here. And particularly, next slide, there's an existing toolkit from DLCD when House Bill 2003 encouraged or required cities to produce a housing production strategy. The legislation was accompanied by this great toolkit that offers a lot of the same tools and strategies that jurisdictions can use for housing production. Many of these are going to be very relevant for transit supportive housing specifically. So on the next slide, you'll see we didn't want to recreate the wheel, and so we do borrow and refer back to the DLCD's toolkit as well. So land use and zoning tools, a lot of coordination and long-term planning. It require, comprehensive plans need to support the goals of TOD and transit integration with land use. Coordination, planning for and zoning for multifamily and mixed use is really important, particularly for that pedestrian walkway or pedestrian, not walkway, the environment. Permitting and entitlement can be streamlined and sped up because that is typically a big delay, a big part of pre-development when housing is being built. And as I mentioned before, because housing development is using debt, any delays incur additional interest costs on the debt, which is called carrying costs, and then eventually just needs to be paid for with the larger construction loan. So speed is one way to reduce costs, which is really helpful for all parties involved. Again, parking minimums, particularly in transit accessible areas, should be reduced or waived in order to encourage and incentivize people using transit. And parking costs a lot of money and takes away from the land that could be used to develop housing. Some estimates suggest that a single parking stall can cost $40,000 in a tuck under or a podium type structure where there's concrete and steel being used in the development. So all of that could be redirected towards the development costs and the smaller loan for operating the property. In addition, innovation pilot programs for testing new policy approaches or regulations we thought were a good conclusion for land use and zoning tools. Next slide. Here's a long list of financial tools and incentives. As you heard me before, many of the successful affordable housing projects require a huge mix of financing tools, from low-cost land to SDC buy downs. And I did see the question in the chat about the need to fund those development costs some way or another. And yeah, cities have been getting very innovative and flexible. There's also some state legislation in draft form right now that would create a revolving loan fund to backfill system development charges that have been waived. I believe that's the nature of the bill. That was when it was a draft last fall. That was one of the goals. So perhaps the state could step in and offer a big pool of money that could be used to offset those development costs. And that's particularly challenging for affordable developments, as we've talked about, because of the funding gap that those projects start out with. So I don't need to read through all of these, but the toolkit and the DLCD toolkit step through a lot of financing and incentive tools that could be used for housing. Next slide. Brian.
Back to me, yes. Real quickly on partnership engagement, I want to focus on two tools I like. One is the idea of stakeholders, is identifying them early in the process and going beyond your traditional stakeholder list to include those who represent affordable housing. I find an effective tool when doing transit development plans to have an affordable housing person on the steering committee. This way you make sure that those voices are heard when you design new service areas and evaluate the current system. And then related to that is on the surveys is make sure that you are giving voice to people who typically don't have a voice. I would go out of your way to connect to low-income individuals, affordable housing, make sure they are participating. I go so far as to dedicate an entire phase to surveys to current riders to make sure that they are not being lost in the general community conversation about transit service. This way you get an idea of where their needs are and making sure that when you design new transit service and new transit routes, you're first doing no harm, and then improving access to those key to affordable housing in low-income communities. Next slide, please. That's pretty much it. Kind of, what this means for us is that, we want to have that clear statewide policy direction, a clearly defined statewide policy position on transport housing needed to foster shared vision amongst agencies and guide the process. Early collaboration is critical. I think we saw that throughout the study, that having partnerships involving stakeholders, involving developers and the like is needed to make sure that transit supportive housing efforts are implemented and to continue. Leverage that existing service. The study shows that measures can be used by state and local governments, private providers, and developers to align housing and land uses plans to leverage transit service and develop affordable housing along those transit corridors. And so they adapt transportation and housing connections to new areas. Affordable housing should not be limited to areas should not be limited to areas with fixed route transit service. Find ways to extend service where you can in those areas. And lastly, center equity and affordability in the planning transit process. Transit providers, local government agencies, all of those involved, are concerned about this issue and need to be involved in the process. And I think that is it. Next slide. A bit long, but we do have some time for some questions. Actually, do have some questions typed up.
You answered the first question. We've got a couple of comments. The first two are about coordination, really. That's kind of the goal of the study. One of the goals is to show how coordination can work and how helpful it can be, because I know we are all making progress on this, but it's a slow trudge to try and get everybody in the same room at the same time and ask the right questions to the right people at the right time. So that is ongoing. Do you guys have any comments to add about helping coordination happen and helping transit development plans happen?
I mean, I would say that harkening back to the statewide policy review task, and maybe there's some promise here with some of the executive orders from Governor Kotek and some of the priorities set out in her initial budget. But really, there is a role for top-down policy guidance, and that can give coverage to the local planners who really do want to make an improvement and a difference in some of these ways. So calling on the agencies to coordinate, create, actually this transportation growth management program is a joint DLCD and ODOT project. And so initiatives like this, studies like the housing and transit study we just went through, I think are all good opportunities, but really just ensuring that the silos are broken down and that transportation and housing are almost discussed in the same breath, like almost all the time. It's that important.
What did you learn about steps cities and agencies are taking to address land value speculation and reduce gentrification and displacement of vulnerable communities in these developments?
Yeah. That's a challenging one. I think that so the Southwest Corridor Equitable Development Strategy that Metro undertook in anticipation of a transit line down the Southwest Corridor that ultimately wasn't funded in the 2020, I think it was 2020 election. That was an interesting one because as soon as the transit line orientation was suggested, land speculation began. So some of the tools we put in the funding and incentive tools, land banking is a huge aspect that cities and counties can undertake, or nonprofit partners can undertake. particularly in a down market when land values might not be growing as rapidly, when development isn't happening at as fast of a clip as in kind of the peak of the market. Land banking and developing affordable housing. Developing affordable housing can actually be counter-cyclical when there's recessionary aspects or when prices aren't rising as much. And people always need affordable housing, A, because there's a lack of it, and B, when jobs are lost or economic downturns occur, people need affordable housing. They need to cut their own household costs. But also in a upcycle, when the market is roaring and housing costs are growing, and even when the economy is strong, people still need affordable housing because their costs are rising and maybe their incomes aren't rising commensurately. So I would say that initiatives like the SWEDS, where there was a full 2 years in advance of the vote on the funding for the light rail, and 12 years in advance of when the light rail would have ever begun construction, the metro planners were working with the community and devising plans and working with the major employers like OHSU to identify what the community might need. There's actually a Southwest Equity Coalition of nonprofits and residents and community members that began under that effort that is living on to this day, and I think has been funded by Metro. So if and when the transit investment conversations resume, they will be ready to organize and speak on behalf of their residents. I'll pause there.
The only thing I would add too is from the federal perspective is that the latest guidance on FTI and CIG applications is placing greater emphasis on affordable housing and preservation. So certainly for those agencies that are pursuing premium transit projects, the feds are actually asking this question as well, is that when you put your application in place, what are you doing for this issue? And how you're going to preserve it going forward.
From a local government point of view, does working with a nonprofit or mission-oriented developer reduce overall costs to a workforce or affordable housing project, and or make workforce or affordable housing more doable?
I'll answer that. And I would say yes, because of the specific funding requirements that are needed to fill the gap. I have a hard time saying yes, that it would reduce overall costs. There's probably just trade-offs, but yes, in making an affordable housing project more doable. I do think that the answer to that question is yes. So braiding together the various funding. So the Eugene example I'll bring up again, because that project required 6 different types of incentives, but also 3 that were either formulaic or competitive. I've heard of affordable housing projects requiring 10 different funding sources. This is just not something that market rate development has to deal with on the same scale. And in addition, operating the property is a very different animal. You have to income certify your tenants. You have to have compliance in place. You have to report on the operating, progress, and what your operating reporting is an ongoing basis, and that has a lot of requirements. So the mission-oriented developers, typically nonprofits, have that specialized knowledge and will probably have a better success rate in terms of getting the application for funding, having a successful application. So I think my answer there is yes.
Did you learn anything about types of creative local financing available for current landowners to maximize existing properties for affordable housing?
Yeah, and the question specifically talks about financing. Capital is definitely a barrier. So creative local financing, some of the things I can think of are CDFIs that will do lower cost loans. I know, I don't know if this is, so one example that's incredibly creative is, I think, Craft 3, which is a mission-oriented CDFI in the Pacific Northwest, not specifically just to Oregon. CDFI stands for Community Development Financial Institution, and they're mission-oriented financial lenders into their communities. They have a couple of programs set up where if an existing homeowner wanted to build an ADU and rent it and put a deed on the house to guarantee that the unit would be rented to a low-income household, Craft 3 will offer lower interest loans than you might get at a credit union or a traditional bank. So the homeowner can save money on the cost of the building. And they also have a partnership set up with, I can't remember exactly who it is, but a partnership set up with a developer of ADUs to streamline that process for you. So if you were a typical homeowner, I don't know if this question is specifically targeting homeowners that are single family dwellings, but this is one example where if you were a homeowner, you could sign up, you could inquire for this funding program and have potentially even pre-planned drawings and pre-planned layouts for your ADU and pick one, and then they would work with you to develop it on site, or even sometimes if it's modular, to just kind of drop it in place and hook it up. And you can get low-cost loans. This is out of pilot phase. It's an actual operating program. That's one example I can think of.
There are two examples from the non-Oregon case studies you highlighted as well. One is in terms of TOD. Dallas established tax increment financing districts around their TODs and used the money generated by that to support affordable housing, giving loans back. And then Seattle has a revolving loan fund that Sound Transit helps to fund, that goes towards providing low interest rate loans to those people around TOD stations to support their development.
We have a few minutes left. While people are thinking of any last questions, I had one. I was wondering if there was anything unique or different about the rural case studies that you did for this study.
Certainly, when you roll case studies, the challenging there is, the lack of transit service. And so what they had to do is creative partnerships and collaborations or cooperation. They found ways to work together to extend the footprint or the range of the transit service that did exist. So certainly, there's a couple there. Now, I didn't highlight the innovative transit support approaches from Wilson and North Carolina and Valdosta, Deseronto Transit Ontario. They again collaborate with the surrounding communities together to form an interagency network group to really kind of support sharing those resources and get this thing done. In the case of another case that's similar to this thing that was not highlighted is Wyoming's with the same challenges with their TDSP, their Transportation Disadvantage Service Plan program. How do you do this at a statewide level? And again, the solution is a level of collaboration, cooperation. Where can you help share those resources, provide additional training, provide joint training centers, help with grant agreements, maybe you do a joint grant agreement to kind of make it to leverage those funds, the economy as a scale kind of thing. From a trial perspective, there are a couple examples out there. We saw developing joint planning efforts, having unified reporting structure, creating their own nonprofit transit agency to receive federal funds and still maintain their sovereignty. So again, with the lack of resources on their own, the best direction is kind of find a way to partner up with somebody else who's got that, and make so you have almost a bigger footprint and able to get better deals or better leverage better agreements with different partners or entities.
And we've had one more question roll in. First and last mile is a huge obstacle to transit even in urban areas such as outer Southwest or East Beaverton and Tigard. There have been plans in recent years to address this, but no significant funding. Any thoughts on how to address that gap?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I can't speak to what you guys are going through out there in Oregon. What we're seeing with these agencies is that these micromobility services are coming in at much lower cost than traditional paratransit service. And they find that providing the first mile, last mile connections through micromobility services, they're able to kind of extend that reach by being more cost effective. So if you can kind of move your ambulatory people over to a micromobility service, that has a lower overall transportation cost than freeing up money for the transportation services, but to extend the reach and do that. It's about finding the right partnerships, I would say, with those entities. A good example here in Florida is St. Petersburg and the PSTA. They extend their footprint after hours by partnering with an Uber, I think Uber actually, to provide subsidies or vouchers to get people from their bus stop to their destination especially after hours and at night for safety consideration. Again, more and more agencies are looking at micromobility to kind of extend that footprint, and in response, a lot of new companies are forming that are finding ways to do this in a much more cost-effective manner than traditional on-demand service provided by the transit agency. I hope that helps. It's a very complicated. This is a new space for transit. Is first mile, last mile connection, and with the rise of micromobility and mobility on demand. And there's still a lot of lessons being learned and discussed on how to do it effectively.
The only other thing I would add to that question is, and specifically in Tigard, I think that as the built form changes over time, as our area continues to grow and amenities and housing is as lots redevelop into amenities and housing, that this issue will be mitigated slowly over time just through natural development. And I was thinking about Tigard because I believe Tigard is going to be getting its first mixed use project. I don't know exactly the road, but Ava Roasteria is planning on building a retail, I think it's a 3-story stick-built project with that was on a site of a former brownfield. And so the owner has been working with the city and the state and county for years to try to clean up the site and redevelop it. And so that will have pedestrian orientation where the site has been vacant for a number of years. And I think that will happen naturally over time, but you're right about significant funding being a barrier, and not every development can afford that or can take that long for that to come to fruition. And pedestrians shouldn't have to wait decades for their neighborhoods to reorient. So I guess, yeah, I'll just end it there. I also wanted to acknowledge that someone offered me an important correction, that the Roseburg Urban Renewal Project, the Sunshine Gardens development, was not on Highway 20. It's on Oregon 138 East. So just in case anyone was noting that down, please note that correction as well.
Okay. Well, this has been a good discussion. I don't see any more questions coming in. So maybe we'll start wrapping up. I wanted to point out that we mentioned the interactive PDF toolkit that we did and how it links to DLCD's Housing Production Strategy Toolkit. Those are two different things for two different audiences, and I was hoping that wasn't confusing. The DLCD toolkit is much more of a what is and how to, and ours is more of a browsable, let's get to know these tools, who can use them, who's got the authority to probably use it, what are some examples from our case studies that you can look at. So ours is really browsable, and it's kind of directed more at leaders and decision makers and people who are really new to this topic and just want to start their browsing. So that's our interactive PDF toolkit on our website. And we have a whole, as we've mentioned throughout, all of our products are available on our website. So if you want to read more about the case studies or any of the other products, we have those available.
Lucius, Michael, looks like one question did come in right as you started wrapping up there. So I want to make sure you saw that.
We have one more question. What steps are being taken to support rehab of existing downtown vacant upper stories, which traditionally provided affordable housing options? Are there any plans to partner with education, state education, or business startups and construction skill training, especially at the high school level, to help with workforce?
I can take a stab at that. The rehabilitation, reconfiguration, renaissance of downtowns is a critical question right now. There's a lot of interest in office to residential conversions and other types of renovations and revitalizations. That's, I think, the word I'm looking for downtowns that have still, like Portland in particular, is about, I think the last research we've seen was that Portland pedestrian visitations to downtown are still about 40% below where they were pre-pandemic. And that is actually a pretty unique situation. Not many other cities, Seattle's a partner with us on this, but a lot of other cities across the country have actually seen their numbers rebound all the way back or surpass pre-pandemic levels. Your question specifically about upper story traditional affordable housing options, I can't answer that specifically. Those would be very unique situations for the unique properties. I can think of a couple like the Joyce Hotel, or that's one example of single room occupancy type affordable housing, usually targeted at people experiencing homelessness or in transition. Very unique, very challenging properties to operate that will require funding, but may not require state level kind of intervention. And then as far as your question about partnering for construction skills, it's going to definitely be an issue. Some estimates suggest that we will need tens of thousands new construction workers entering the workforce, and particularly shifting from office or commercial construction to residential construction, which typically has lower wages. So there's a couple of headwinds facing the workforce, construction workforce needs, in order, particularly Governor Kotek, to meet the ambitious goals that she just set out for the state. So I'm sure that won't be overlooked, and that some apprenticeships or training programs will need to be supported for those efforts.
Okay. Well, we've got a couple minutes, but I don't see any more questions rolling in. So I'll finish our little wrap up. Remember, everything's available on our website for all of our products for staff people who want to dig in and learn more. And also our final report. That may sound a little boring, but it's actually a really good summary of everything that we learned in the study. So do check that out if you want everything together concisely. And I wanted to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to TGM for hosting us and DLCD for helping us, our presenters who took their time out for us today, and all our participants today, including folks who participated throughout the study, because we had people participate in surveys, we had people participate in interviews for the Oregon case studies. So thank you to everybody for their participation. And someone mentions that the City of Roeburg has an amended code to allow for SRO housing. So we are making progress in our cities, slowly but surely. And thank you to everybody. Is there anything else for wrap up that you guys wanted to say?
I just say thank you to you, Lucia, for managing the project for us and continuing to get the word out about all of this work. So, and thanks to the panelists today.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.